everybody. Welcome to another episode of the OIG Roundtable. I am Eric Rubenstein, the Senior Director of Litigation, Fraud, Waste, and Abuse here, and I'm joined with my two partners in crime for this week's episode. As always, Wade McFall. I've changed it. I think I'm going to start calling you Wade McFall just to change it up a little bit. But Wade McFall, Wade McFall, depends upon where you are, east or west of the Mississippi. Retired Assistant Special Agent in Charge from the LA Field Office, and now a manager on our SIU team. And of course, Matt Kachansky, who has been in the industry for 75 years, which is amazing for a guy that's only 40. Retired Special Agent in Charge from HHS OIG, the retired Northeast UPIC Director, and my counterpart as the Director of the Payment Integrity Team for Advise. Matt, you're looking good for having been in the industry for 70 plus years and only being 40, from the womb your parents were educating you.
Harry Truman was the first one to get a Medicare card, and I was second in line.
You know who second? Do you know who the second one was, really?
Was it his wife?
It was his wife. That is correct. I think his Medicare number was 1.
Yeah.
All right, so today we want to talk about, there was a press release the other day. We're going to divert a little bit off of the SIU conversation. We're going to go back to talking about cases. There was a press release the other day about something known as Operation Nightingale Part 2. Operation Nightingale Part 1 was in 2023. It resulted in 30 people being arrested, I think all in the Florida area, for fraud relative to nursing diplomas and individuals who were getting nursing diplomas who didn't actually graduate nursing school, who then sat for the medical boards, and it appears, oddly, passed the medical boards. And it looks like a lot of these schools that were giving out these diplomas, there were 7,300 bogus diplomas given out. I take a little bit of issue with the fact that they're calling this Operation Nightingale. I don't know. It's kind of weird. I mean, not every nurse is a Nightingale. There are some that do other things. But so Operation Nightingale resulted in 30 charges, convictions, pleas, what have you. 7,300 bogus degrees for nursing given out, and then people sitting and taking the test. And for those that don't know, nursing as a licensure is, although it's individualized by state, there is a interesting little quirk, not really a quirk, but about 40 or 45 states, I think somewhere in that area, 43, 44, something like that, have adopted what they call the compact license, which means that they have reciprocity. If you have a license in one state and the state participates in the compact licensure program, your license is good in another state. So there are a lot of people that go out, become nurses, and they live in the state of Florida, for example, but then they move to Texas because they want to get a job, and their license carries over. You have to file some paperwork, but then you wind up having the compact license, and then you're good to go. There are some states that don't recognize it, that are on the way. I know New Jersey, for example, didn't recognize it, but there is a bill that I think just passed that's going to allow that to happen. So more and more states are moving over to that. In round 2 of Operation Nightingale Part 2, I really need to talk to the people at the OIG and find out who it is that's naming these things. You know, when they did the one with the genetic testing, Operation Double Helix or whatever it is, I get it. DNA strands, double helix, I get it, but I just want to know. I might have to talk to the Deputy Inspector General for Investigations, find out who their marketing person is, or is that Department of Justice that's doing that? So, but in any event, in part 2 of this, it appears 12 more people were charged relative to this fraud scheme. And, what happens directly is people wind up getting licenses that have no business getting licenses because they didn't complete the course of study. Although it is a little bit like Frank Abagnale, if you remember Catch Me If You Can, where he went and sat to the bar, I think in Louisiana, and actually passed the bar exam. But never went to law school and actually studied for the bar and passed it, which is a remarkable thing. So it obviously is something that's happened, but it does kind of beg the question on, this seems to me like a very simple state-related due diligence. And Wade, we were talking about this just yesterday and today. It should be, of all the things, this should be the easy button, notwithstanding any backlogs and things of that sort, but it would seem that from a due diligence perspective, this is the easiest one. And I know you gave the reference of they'll never know, they're going to know, they're never going to know. But there really is something to be said about that, where if you are, from an investigator's perspective, it does seem like there should be some ways to go and get some verification. Now, in this case, the problem is that we know that these diplomas were bogus, and we know that the schools were giving out these diplomas, but there has to be some other information out there that we could be doing to check. For example, are these schools accredited regionally, nationally? What sort of due diligence can we do to identify whether or not these people are legitimate? But it does seem like some basic background information could be done in support of identifying whether or not these are legitimate degrees or not. Obviously, there are thousands of people that go through nursing school, so there's potentially a volume issue. But this is another one of those weird head scratchers. And I think, Matt, in a minute, we're going to get to you, but there is an implication from a billing and coding and documentation perspective. But Wade, it starts with being able to adequately, appropriately, and confidently determine that the people who say that they are who they are the people who say they are who they are.
Yeah, and it goes back to, as we were discussing earlier, it's, all the compliance programs, you have training every year, and it talks about your due diligence. And I think everybody who's hiring providers of whatever type, whether it's a physician or a nurse or whatever, everybody's checking the list of excluded individuals and entities that the OIG puts out, or they should be anyways. And this, of course, wouldn't show up on that because they're not excluded. There are, however, a number of internet-based search engines that you can use to do your due diligence. There's nurses.com, which claims to have license verification, disciplinary actions, a quick confirm aspect. You have healthguideusa.org, which has nursing license lookup for various types of nurses. There's state boards for each state. There's verifiable.com, which I think has a link to each state, and it claims to be able to have credentialing and monitoring. But as we were talking before this podcast, you don't think that you have to work backwards from that. It's like, well, it's verified, their license is verified, their various things that these will show, but you don't think that you have to go back and make sure that that verification for the license isn't based on a fraudulent, diploma. So you may have to start with these web-based search engines, but you may have to go back, and this should be relatively easy on the internet nowadays, but go back and contact the nursing school and find out if that, diploma or whatever documentation to show that they went through and passed the nursing program is legitimate. So it's probably something that you really wouldn't think you'd have to do. Like if you verified their license and a couple of these other things, it's like due diligence, check, I've done this, it's good. But if people see this press release and see how many, I forget the number, but how many fake diplomas they came across, it might be part of what people are going to have to start doing is not only verify the license, but go back and verify the schooling as well.
Yeah, so in this press release, it was 7,300. So 7,300 fake ones. Now, the problem obviously is that if you're trying to go and get this independent verification, it's the fox watching the hen house, right? So you're trying to go and get this independent verification. The problem is that you're going to a school that was giving out fake diplomas to begin with. So there's a little bit of a circular investigative problem that you run into, where you're getting the prospect of getting information from a school that's giving out licenses that shouldn't exist. Now, collaterally, there was a case a number of years ago in Puerto Rico. I was still at the OIG when it occurred, and people who had gone through medical school, purportedly legitimately in Puerto Rico, and sat for the medical boards in Puerto Rico and failed it, had some connections to people inside of that state licensing organization, and they were bribing people to change their grades to give them licenses. And so there were a few roundups there. I forget what they called it. It wasn't Operation Nightingale. It's probably something very catchy and similar, where we did a very large roundup of people that were practicing medical doctors who had failed the medical boards for Puerto Rico. And my understanding is that the medical boards for Puerto Rico are easier than some other states. And so you've got people who are maybe marginal. They were marginal students because they couldn't pass the medical boards, and then they're out there practicing practicing as doctors. But it certainly does beg the question, Wade, because the problem is that to some extent you have to rely upon maybe independent verification. And if you are at the licensing board or somewhere where you sit for the compact licensing, and you're uploading or you're providing any documentation, you're providing false documentation that is going to be backstopped by the school that's provided you the backstopping false documentation. So the question becomes, collaterally, what other things could you do out there to independently verify? And one of the things that I would be thinking of is, are these schools regionally or nationally accredited? And then if they are, I would be contacting the national or the regional accrediting organizations that are doing that. Sometimes the U.S. Department of Education, you might be calling there and nobody will answer that phone. Or if it's regional, it might be some state department of education. And certainly wherever that school is going to be, if it's a not-for-profit or anything, some additional steps that could be taken. And that's probably something that would be done on the investigative side of the state to be able to confirm that. But it does present itself with a little bit of a challenge because you're ultimately going to be getting fraudulent documents from the originator of the fraudulent documents, which is an otherwise legitimate-looking institution. And ultimately, how the documents got generated and all that, we didn't see anything of that in the press release. And we don't know if these schools were entirely bogus, or were there people in the back rooms being paid a bribe to do it, or what have you. So it's something to think about. And obviously connecting up with state licensure boards and state departments of education and things of that sort for accreditation would certainly go a long way. But Matt, it kind of also then begs the question, because if the person is not a nurse practitioner, an NPP as they call it, non-physician practitioner, if the person is not a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant or something like that, and they're just a Bachelor of Science nurse, an associate's in nursing, registered nurse, LPN, whatever it may be, where they're taking these exams, they don't get an NPI number. They don't get a National Provider Identifier, which means that they're not being run through advanced provider screening and what's known as NPAS, which is the National Provider network that is run by CMS to give people an NPI number. You go to NPAS and you complete the NPAS application. You get your Medicare, you get your NPI number, and then you go through advanced provider screening to be able to actually get it up and running. And so it does kind of be a question, Matt, that if a nurse goes to get a job at a doctor's office or in a facility, particularly let's talk about SNFs, skilled nursing facilities, rehab, hospice, any of that, the work that the nurses are doing in those facilities is directly billable to the program. And so now you're falling into this kind of category of knew or should have known from a civil perspective, maybe even criminality for healthcare fraud if you knew the person wasn't licensed. I mean, we see cases all the time where providers get prosecuted for using unlicensed individuals. We see it a lot in physical therapy. We see it with nursing services, people that have an expired license, people that are excluded, right? To get back to Wade's list of excluded individuals and entities, that monthly table. But if you're working as a nurse in a hospital, that DRG or diagnostic related group claim that's submitted to Medicare or to the commercial payer is going to include items, services, and procedures that are rendered by a nurse. And so the question then becomes, does the hospital or facility, whatever it may be, do they have another level of fiduciary responsibility to confirm that licensure? And then the kind of the follow-up question is, if they've confirmed that the license is active, what more should they be doing, if anything? Because their job is to make sure they're hiring people that are duly licensed. The state has issued a license, and so the argument is they're duly licensed.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. The easy answer is, if someone's not licensed and they're part of a service for which claims are submitted, I believe it's part of any provider's agreement with the plan is that duly credentialed people with the credentials to do those services are providing them. So if they're violating that by having a non-licensed person, they should not be able to, be recompensed for those claims. I know on the exclusion side, they try to separate someone's excluded from Medicare and Medicaid, and it's a large institution. Oh, they're only seeing private pay patients or whatever. They try to build that Chinese wall. Here, there's no such thing because they're not licensed for anybody. But it is difficult to prove that the nursing home or the hospital or even the provider's office knew, because the whole process is showing that they were duly licensed. They got their license on a multi-tiered background where the nursing school, all of which are closed now, that were providing these licenses, provided the license, whether it was real or not. It looked real enough to the board that was doing these exams. So they took the exam, they passed the exam. So for the state sees it as they've done everything they need to do to be licensed in my state. They passed that board. The board did their background. They got the license from the licensing institution, from the school. So it's a difficult situation to try to prove that anybody down the chain knew that these people weren't licensed. You can do all the background you want in terms of going to the nursing websites and seeing they're all licensed, because it was all under a false premise that no one could figure out until, I guess, I don't know how they finally found out about this stuff, but
it's certainly a tricky case. I mean, my gut is telling me that at least on the initial case, that there was probably somebody cooperating or something like that, because this was 7,300 bogus degrees. Now, it could have been just a handful of schools, right? So it looks like they were all in Florida or South Florida. And, there's no fraud going on in Florida, and there's certainly no healthcare fraud in South Florida. So this is obviously a unique one, but it does kind of beg the question. For so many degrees, it was clearly not going. It's not like it was hundreds of schools or dozens of schools, maybe a very limited number of schools that were involved in this. But it certainly does raise the question, not so much for us about how this case originated, because that doesn't really matter at this point, and we'll never really know how it necessarily originated. But it does kind of beg the question about, is this something that is more systemic in the industry? People that are not, truly, I mean, we see constantly false documents, all the time, companies producing, I've seen degrees that look like they came from Cornell that were, obviously fakes, but, at the end of the day, appeared to be real. And so it kind of, the question then becomes, from a facility, let's say a hospital or a SNF or a hospice, from their perspective, from a compliance perspective, do they have another level of fiduciary responsibility to ensure, outside of doing the normal things like the exclusions check and the preclusion checks and SAM and all of that, do they have another layer of fiduciary responsibility? Or is the whole point that if you're relying upon the state to say this person is licensed, like that's where it ends? Now the problem is going to be that if that ultimately becomes the case, is the facility then on the hook, at least civilly or administratively, to pay back money that was tied to claims that were for people that were otherwise unlicensed? And I think that that's probably a challenge, because the argument is, if you're taking a couple of things into play in the civil realm, we talk about knew or should have known. And then if you go to the recent case involving what's known as super value, where it was the subjective understanding or the subjective belief, right, which is you have to crawl inside someone's head to be able to understand that. And I think part of that argument is going to be, hey, look, our subjective belief is that this person was properly licensed. So this is an interesting set of facts, because at the end of the day, how do you prove? It's almost like having to prove the negative.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you look at it now, all these schools are closed. It's 7,300 people. Maybe now if you're doing recredentialing of people and you see that their license, from the state of Florida or wherever they might be licensed, was the result of their going to that school, you might want to do some recredentialing. And from that point forward, you might have that the elements of the law for the civil fraud, any claim from this state forward, you knew or should have known if you allowed this person to continue their employment, knowing that there's a good chance that they came from a bogus licensing or a bogus degree. But at the beginning, it's really hard. And I think, like I said, should they have been paid for the claim? No. So I think there might be unjust enrichment and get that money back. But I don't think it's any part of a civil penalty or anything at that point. It would be very difficult to prove the knowledge factor.
Right. And I think, part of that is going to be, was there any patient harm? Were there any of these plus factors? But I think at the end of the day, the argument, if I was working on behalf of the facility and maybe some overpayment letter was sent that says you should not have been paid for these services because you employed someone that wasn't licensed, my pushback would simply be, they passed the state board, they had a valid license from the state, what more should we do? And I think that's where it becomes very challenging, is that if there's backstopping that supported whatever, that license, and the state did whatever their vetting is, and obviously every state's vetting is going to be a little different, but particularly if you've got a compact license, and that becomes the big challenge, is that if you have a compact license, you are relying upon one state's vetting process to allow someone else to do something. It's a little bit like a driver's license, right? While a driver's license in Florida, I can't, I could drive my car in New Jersey with it, but it's not a valid separate license. It's not like a national ID card. And if I moved back to New Jersey, if I made New Jersey my permanent address again, I'd have to get a New Jersey driver's license. So, the challenge is that you are relying upon the state of New Jersey is relying upon the state of Florida, if I've never had a New Jersey license or whatever, to say, hey, this person met the criteria to drive a car in Florida, then they must be good in the state of New Jersey. And,
yeah, but when you go to get your New Jersey license, do they make you take a test, or do they rely on the fact that you have a Florida license to say, oh, you must be a valid driver? Here's your license.
And vice versa. When I relocated and made Florida my permanent address, they relied on that. Now, what's interesting is that, different states, so if you've ever driven in the state of New Jersey, you're all familiar with the jug handle. There are very few left-hand turns in New Jersey. You have to go to the right lane and jug handle it and go over. And what winds up happening is people that don't drive in New Jersey and aren't familiar with it, they're in the left lane trying to make a left-hand turn, wreaking havoc, even though there are signs everywhere that may say no turns, but you don't know it if you don't drive in the state of New Jersey. And so, there is an argument to be made that when you have a license in one state, in a compact license space, there's, that reciprocity, you're relying upon a different state to give you that pass. Now, in what they'll say in New Jersey, and all my friends that are cops in New Jersey will always say that just because you have a license from another state and you have the ability to drive in that state, it doesn't absolve you of the responsibility of knowing what the local traffic laws are and the vehicle, all of that. So that's not taking that away. But certainly, if I'm working in a hospital and I've given them proof that I'm licensed, even though that license is false, the facility's argument is, I have met my requirement. Eric Rubenstein is not excluded. He's not precluded. He's not on any other issues. It doesn't look like in his home state, Florida, he ever had any sanctions. He doesn't have any charges again. None of that. You can do all of that vetting, but they're going to come back and say, like, how much more should we be doing, right? You can't physically go to every school. And even if it is a real brick and mortar school, who's to say that it's otherwise legitimate? Now you can get a degree in nursing online, where some of the courses are in person, right? You see people on a lot of online universities. If you've already got a nursing associates, for example, and you're already a licensed nurse and you want to get a bachelor of nursing, you can do a lot of that through online courses. So it makes it even more challenging. And that's where I think, understanding if the person went to a school that's regionally or nationally accredited. And I still think I think a lot of this still falls back to the states. And obviously the problem is, and I think, Matt, you brought this up, is that some states are seeing huge backlogs for licensure. So the question is, are they dropping their ball, are they lowering their guard to let people through without additional levels of vetting or anything like that? I think it's going to remain to be seen. Wait, I'll give you the final word on this. I mean, there's 12 more people. This is 7,300 bogus degrees out there. We've got the first roundup in 2023, 30 people, another 12. Are they finding 7,300 people?
No, and I think the interesting part, which I don't think the press release covers it, I'm sure the investigation uncovered it, but so are these people who are getting the fraudulent diplomas, have they gone through and actually done all the work and just were unable to pass, their final exams? Or do they just sign up and pay a fee and don't do any of the training at all and get basically a mail order diploma, there's a huge difference there. And if that's the case, I would think the way investigations work, that they would be talking to nurses they're not nurses, but people with bogus diplomas who are going to flip to, they'll talk to keep themselves out of jail. They should be able to find out if they did actually take the training and they were just unable to pass the exams, or is this just totally like, send us your credit card and we'll send you a diploma? And I also think there's a big difference too. I have a feeling that it's a couple one-off like employees of the school. I can't imagine that the school, although there's some other high-profile schools that were totally bogus in the past few years, but I can't imagine that most schools would be, their whole goal is just to give bogus diplomas. I would think that it's somebody in the credentialing department who's taking kickbacks to, make, basically counterfeit diplomas. And in that case, you would be able to find out, going back to your due diligence, if it's a employee from that department who's basically printing you out a diploma, it should be pretty easy to go back and see that there's not a legitimate diploma with all the other nurses who
Right.
went through the training and took the final exams and all that stuff. So there's a couple variables there that I think makes a huge difference.
Yeah, but that also presupposes that the school had an air of legitimacy to it.
Right.
It says some of the defendants are the nursing school owners.
Right.
So the whole thing could have been bogus.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But then how did they pass the boards? That could be, like Wade said earlier, that could be another test. That could be another case. How did they pass these boards if they didn't pass their school?
And that's the part that boggles my mind, because if you weren't going to spend the time to actually go through the nursing program and graduate legitimately, are you really spending the time to spend the effort, the brain power to study to do this? The other thing that I think is interesting, and we'll kind of leave it with this, is if you really didn't go through the nursing program, which includes internships, right, and training and all of that, how do you even know how to do the job?
Yeah.
I mean, nurses aren't just changing bedpans and sheets, right? There's diagnostic tests that they do. There's clinical didactic related work, IVs, right? If you're, medication administration, documenting, vernacular, right? I mean, medical vernacular and terminology, anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, all of that are things that are a challenge. I mean, for those that don't know, I was an EMT and a paramedic for a very long time. I worked for New York City EMS for a little bit. I worked when I was in college in Buffalo. And I will tell you, anatomy, physiology, and pharmacology are pretty hard. Just learning how to understand the metabolism and things of that sort for doing something as simple as an IV is a challenge. But you've got to learn how to, administering the IV, administering injections, medications. It's not easy. And I'm not a science person. And so I had, some challenges with some of those courses, but I can only imagine it's mind boggling to me that if someone got a bogus degree from a nursing school and was able to sit and pass the written exam, that in and of itself is that to me is a little bit on the interesting side. But yeah, and I think, these are going to be for-profit schools. And then the question becomes, are they accredited? And I think that's what it's ultimately going to come back to. Are they accredited? And what was the accreditation process? And if they are real schools, were they just intermixing these bogus degrees with real degrees? and going through the process that way, because 7,300 is a lot of degrees. Now, obviously, we don't know the time period of this, but 7,300 for what appears to be maybe a small number of schools. I would also be really curious to know, and I don't know if Laura from this says, were the people that own these schools connected to each other? Because again, the circus doesn't change, just the clowns in the tent. And so the question becomes, were these people all connected to each other and saying, hey, I have found a way to hit the money tree. We're going to get a lot of money from people, which then creates a final collateral question, which is, if they were accredited, were the people that went there eligible for student loans? And were they able to get student loans or grants, educational grants, that were either through the state or through Department of Education or some charitable organization? So you've got like all these collateral pieces of the puzzle that kind of fit in. Interesting. I mean, I forgot about this case, and then when I saw the press release on this kind of round two, it reminded me of the one from a few years ago, and then it reminded me of the one that we worked on out of Puerto Rico. So, I'm wondering if there's going to be more to this or not. 7,300 seems like an awful lot to try to hunt down and prosecute and fine, but you never know. And if they're all licensed somewhere, there's going to be a way to find them, because they're all licensed and probably working somewhere and earning a living. And so it's going to be interesting to see if this goes any further. This is from 2023. And now we're coming up to the end of 2025. So the wheels of justice continue to churn along on this. So interesting case. We'll see where it goes. I think collaterally, the fraud potential, the FWA issues with these kind of things are always going to be there. But we'll see what happens with it. We'll keep our eye on it. So as always, good seeing you guys. Good ideas, good thoughts, good conversation. Thanks to everybody who tunes in again every week. We've got our next LinkedIn Live coming up at the end of the month. Dan Olson and I, again, part 2, talking about data from the investigator's perspective. We're going to be talking about why it's important to understand the life cycle of a claim, and also talk about modeling your data edits and things of that sort from an FWA perspective. So that's going to be at the end of the month. I think it's September 30th we're doing that. So tune in for that one. And again, the newsletter every Friday comes to your inbox. We look forward to chatting with you and communicating with you on LinkedIn and through all of our social media platforms. Again, you can always get our previously recorded LinkedIns, and you can get our weekly podcast on Spotify, on our YouTube channel. Just go up to YouTube and subscribe, as well as getting it through the newsletter. So until next time, we'll see you on the next OIG Roundtable. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.